Hello, it's Pronogo. This is the review for StarCraft Aftermath, created by Christopher Ang. This is another campaign made for the 2009 Campaign Creations Campaign Contest. So this is just like Echoes and Vile Aggression. It's like that same era. Now, unlike those other two campaigns, this one has been updated as recently as 2018, earlier this year. And Chris, the author, personally requested that I run the campaign and essentially wanted to use the feedback to improve his design process. He felt like he could still learn something from this campaign being deconstructed. And so in addition to like the normal segments that I've been doing for these reviews, where I take the story and the gameplay and I sort of break them down as best I can, although obviously I skipped story for a lot of the other productions, but more recently with Echoes and the ZGTC, I've talked about story and gameplay separately. I'm going to do that with this production, and I'm also going to have an additional segment that I'll call like Paths to Improvement. And basically I'll go over ways that I think the design philosophy or the design process could be improved based on what I think I've reverse engineered from the end product. And so, of course, some of that might be a bit more hit or miss, but I think that that'll be useful for all developers as well, because maybe they didn't think of this sort of thing in the same way that I'm thinking about it. And maybe there's something that they can use that maybe I don't even explicitly say. Maybe they just come to a different kind of conclusion because they start thinking about things in a different way based on stuff that I say. So hopefully it's useful is the bottom line, but I'm just letting you guys know now that there's going to be a new section at the end. Very exciting. So let's start with the story. I feel like it's a fine point to start with most productions. There's also not as much to say about the story as there is for the gameplay in StarCraft Aftermath in general. And I'm going to try to be pretty comprehensive. I know that in a lot of my feedback, a lot of the videos, I said that a lot of my criticisms of the campaign and its missions felt pretty common sense to me. And I think that because of that, because I'm seeing problems that I would consider common sense that I wouldn't expect to see in any productions, I'm going to try to be as comprehensive as possible with this review so that hopefully we can start weeding out in modern productions, at the very least, those kind of what I view as common sense issues, because presumably the fact that I view it as common sense, but it's still being an issue in modern day productions, in future productions as well, I'm sure there will be some campaigns that I play that have not yet been made that I still find common sense stuff in. I'm just going to try to document all that stuff in this review and in reviews like it and in other productions in the future so that people can basically have a better idea what I mean. So some of this stuff might seem entry level to you. If you are a developer and you already feel like you know what I'm talking about, feel free to skip ahead or whatever. But I'm just, again, letting you guys know now, there's going to be some common sense stuff. So obviously, the first thing that might seem a little strange about StarCraft Aftermath is that when you start or even before you start the maps, you have the map description, and it's not used as real estate to like embark a theme, or I guess impart a theme rather, to the audience. It's not really used the way that I have used them historically, where it's sort of like is almost like I guess if you ever have watched Netflix or even maybe like looked at a TV guide, it'll basically have you look at this like description of an episode or a description of a movie. It's like a one-line pitch for what the movie is about, what the episode is about. And that's sort of how I've used it for things like in Consummate and Project Hydra. And I feel like that's an okay way to use it. But I also think it's totally fine to not use it at all for that and just to say, made by me, mission one of whatever you want to put in there. And not use it at all for anything, and make it so that the only thing that is pertinent to that mission is the mission's title and the number in like the order in which it is meant to be played. And so you see, oh, this is map 3, Web of Intrigue, or maybe that was map 2. Honestly, I don't remember. And you can decide, hey, this is map 1, the Cure, and like that's all I know about this map as far as it slots into this campaign. So maybe that's all you want to do. That's totally up to you. That's designing that to your taste. By all means, it depends on what you're trying to go for, what your intent is. I like to use it as a way, again, to like try to impart some sort of theme or give the player some sort of heads up as to what the map is going to be about. And then they can start to, also let that sink in through the briefing and the opening text. But I can totally see an argument for just doing that through the briefing, just doing that for an opening cutscene or the gameplay or whatever, and not needing the map description filled in at all. That's totally fine. Now, when it comes to the text that bookended every single map, this actually broke a lot of the story pacing. So for the first map, it feels pretty like cut and dry. It's very played out. as a concept for StarCraft campaigns, that they have some sort of text crawl that explains a whole lot about the overall, state of affairs. And I thought that was all we were going to get, but even that is pretty bad. I would say that in general, I actually don't think there's an excuse to have any text crawl at all. I think you just throw people into the middle of a story and you have them figure shit out based on context clues. I think I talked about this it was either map 2 or map 3, probably. Maybe it was even map 4. But I'm sure I talked about it in the playthrough, is the bottom line. And I think that at the end of the day, there's a huge lack of people who are willing to completely eschew text epilogues or text prologues in this case. And for whatever reason, StarCraft Aftermath read like more of a fan fiction in those instances. It wasn't like it was trying to even set up for the setting of the campaign. It wasn't even like it was trying to color some element. It actually felt like it was like fan fiction chapters that were reformatted into like, oh, I can slot this text in here instead of showing this through a mission. You know what I mean? So it felt very much like almost like a book adaptation or something. It was very weird. In which case, I don't know why you wouldn't just make missions for that. Obviously, this is, again, for a campaign contest, but it still just doesn't make any sense to me that you would spend time writing that text instead of, making the missions impart that sort of information. Whatever information you're trying to impart through text, you can impart through gameplay, you can impart through dialogue, you can do it better. You can do it in a more efficient manner. And so I feel like text is like the least efficient manner to do that in, especially given the fact that this is an audio-visual medium. Especially since it's gameplay as well, there's like interactivity. You really shouldn't have me reading a book, essentially, is like the bottom line. The fact that it is text is bad enough, but the fact that it is also bookends every mission, again, breaks the story pacing. The story pacing is really a big deal. You don't want to make it so that each mission feels like its own mission, like its own one-off that is not linked at all. Echoes had this like weird timeline that it was playing around with, but even despite the timeline stuff, which could have been executed better and is a fine concept by itself, I suppose, the fact that all of the missions had something that connected them based around the Nightmare Zerg and the UED, and some had characters in them and whatever, that is still better than what StarCraft Aftermath did, where there are some like characters like Artanis and Zertula, and all of the 3 missions are involved in all 3 of the Protoss missions, and Kerrigan is involved in all of the 3 Zerg missions. But aside from that, it really just feels like a bunch of disconnected stories. And again, the text does not help with that, because the text really like time cuts, it time jumps. So suddenly, we're like a month into the future, or we have no idea how much time into the future we are, but we just know that we are some point after the first mission, and for whatever reason, we're dealing with something that, again, it should be told to us, or rather shown to us instead of being told to us. And so that was like a really big deal. I did not feel like any of the missions were connected. It felt very disconnected, very, very inconsistent. It didn't help that the dialogue was really hard to understand, especially when it was, a lot of Kerrigan's lines were really hard to understand, but especially the unnamed Cerebret. And every single time Zeratul opened his mouth, he talked in some incomprehensible jargon. I could not understand anything he was saying. Part of this is because the lines themselves are not good, but another part of this is because of the fact that they're split up. So normally when you have a line of dialogue, sometimes it can be pretty long, but most of the time you should try to keep it short, because, again, your primary mode of communicating the story is through the gameplay. It's not through dialogue. It's not through these conventional means that we think of when we read books and we watch movies. It's through gameplay. And I'll get into that in a bit. But when it comes to lines of dialogue, what you have with dialogue is an opportunity to express character, the character of a character, essentially without using gameplay in the middle of a cutscene or something like that. But also, just generally speaking, for RTSs, you're probably going to need to use dialogue in a lot of cases, because you can't use like facial expressions. You can't use like a change in state of gameplay a lot of the time. So you're going to have to use dialogue for like expressing character and communicating to the player somehow in certain times where gameplay just doesn't cut it. And that would be like warning the player of a big attack or something, if that's what you want to do. But when you have dialogue, you have a paragraph, a single transmission. This sort of thing essentially belies that this character is speaking and everything that they say is connected to itself and is sort of like acting as a single thought or a single series of thoughts. And it's all meant to be taken as like a single statement, even if it's multiple sentences. And so when you have a situation where you have a bunch of delayed transmissions that the text does not appear alongside, especially when you don't have voice acting. It's very hard for me to follow along because I'm interpreting all of these as individual thoughts that are not necessarily connected to one another, even though they come in sequence, because they're not all in the same transmission, they're not all in the same statement, and it's really hard for me to follow along. The text isn't on screen all at the same time. It's hard for me to read that, even when I go back and watch the videos and just look at the text. Even if I muted it or whatever, it would still be really hard for me to follow along and understand what the characters were trying to say. And so it's very difficult for you to communicate that way. It's very difficult for you to communicate the character's intentions. Whatever you're trying to, whatever you intend to communicate with that line is made much more hard, much more difficult. And you're making your life a lot more difficult than it needs to be based on that. So I would definitely suggest compressing them into individual transmissions and make it so that the points serve like some sort of, well, I was going to say serve some sort of purpose and point. Essentially, like whatever they're trying to say, whatever statement they're trying to make, that needs to make sense within the context of why you need a dialogue line there at all. And then it needs to make sense in terms of the kind of dialogue line it's meant to be and whatever that dialogue line is meant to communicate to the player. And in this case, or in many cases within StarCraft Aftermath, I felt like the dialogue was meant to communicate something, but I didn't know what that something was because it was so poorly communicated. So this is like another real big issue. So the fact that the dialogue felt horribly disconnected from itself made it even further difficult to understand what the fuck the dialogue meant was, like what the significance of the dialogue was when taken into account with these disconnected missions that didn't feel connected to each other. And so the dialogue doesn't feel connected to itself, nor does it feel connected to the mission that we're playing, nor does the mission we're playing feel connected to the other missions we have played. So the entire campaign, again, feels like just a series of individual moments or whatever that are not at all connected to each other. And that was a pretty big issue. This might also seem like a gameplay-focused heckle, but again, like I mentioned earlier, I think that gameplay is your primary mode of communicating story information to the player, primary mode of presenting that information. Due to the gimmicky and hacky manner that the gameplay was sort of presented, playing the campaign tells a very different story than the dialogue and the text would have you believe. And since the dialogue and the text are presenting different stories from each other, and the maps themselves don't feel connected to each other, you also have this issue of the campaign, like the gameplay, telling a third different story than the text tells, than the dialogue tells. So you really have no idea what to believe. It's very, like, I don't even think schizophrenic is a word that does it justice. And so you really don't feel feel connected to the narrative. The narrative itself does not feel connected to itself. I would say that it's best to consider the gameplay from these sort of perspectives. If you had no dialogue, no voice acting, no text, nothing, no story content that wasn't the gameplay itself, what would watching a playthrough of this game tell you? What would watching a playthrough of this map tell you? Look at map 3 as an example. I forget the name of map 3, like Web of Intrigue, maybe that's map 2, I don't remember. But the bottom line is, I start this mission with 12 Mutalisks, I attack always the left side because there's no other proper way to do it. Meanwhile, if you look at the bottom right-hand side, say you have map hacks and you see the whole thing, you're watching as an outside observer, just watching me play and watching the whatever the Terrans were, I think they were like Mercs and Umojans and Dominion, watching them fight back. If you were to just watch the events, the Dominion Marines would be spinning around in the bottom right-hand corner or the bottom middle because they're walled off with turrets. That bridge of insanity that I killed with a bunch of Guardians, like 9 Guardians or something, that was really obvious. Like, the story that tells is not one that makes any sense. That doesn't even really belong in a comedy project as far as I'm concerned. So you have a lot of problems with the way that the story that the gameplay is telling you. If you were to just watch like a replay and tell me what that story was, you would be really hard-pressed to tell anything coherent from that gameplay. So what you want to do is find a way to make the gameplay tell a story that is reinforced, not contradicted by the text, by the dialogue, by whatever other components of the presentation of the story that you have. Like, gameplay is your primary one, but then there's dialogue, and then there's environmental elements too, like the custom doodads that I made for Inconsummate, for example. You can make custom terrain for your StarCraft mod, and you can set, have a set design or whatever. In a game like Doom, this would be just the environment that you're walking around, like the decals on the walls or whatever they use. I don't know the technical terms for that, but I know Dynamo is a Doom developer, so he can probably shed some light on the comments if he ends up watching this. Basically, you would have something like that. You'd have, in StarCraft 2, you obviously can place doodads and stuff as well. You can like make your own models or whatever you want to do with that. In Unreal, you'd be designing your own game. Say that you're talking about like a third-person shooter or something like Gears of War, well, the positioning of bodies and what damage is done to them, maybe that has something to do with how they were killed, and that belies like the creatures that are yet to be discovered in this area that you haven't been in yet. And so like that's a set design, that's environment design, that's telling a story through visuals. So there's all of this visual storytelling and set design storytelling that's happening based on the environment. And so that's another way that you can tell a story. And basically everything that you're using should be telling the same story, should be basically telling the same story in a different manner, but to the same end. And so you're basically using like visuals to tell a different story, a different part of that same story rather than the gameplay. The gameplay is telling the story of like how aggressive the enemies are right now, but maybe the set design belies how aggressive the enemies were back before you got here by showing you the carnage that they caused. Maybe the voice lines belie past experiences that the characters have with this enemy. And so that tells you what you can expect from this enemy. And, you know, that would be like the emotion in the voiceovers. Or I guess in the text in this case, since there is no voiceover, like the dialogue or whatever. So, you know, all of this stuff should be telling a coherent story, working together to bring you a cohesive, consistent, connected story. Instead, in Aftermath, the gameplay tells a different story than the text tells a different story than the dialogue, and so on and so forth. So, like I was saying, a general lack of cohesion and consistency is apparent. It translates into gameplay. We can segue right into the gameplay now and talk about what I feel went so wrong with the gameplay. So let's just take the Zerg campaign for an example. The first 3 missions basically had minimal changes to the way that the player interacted with their environment. Like, that wasn't modified too much, but all of the missions had gimmicked AI. This includes the Protoss stuff. Spawned attack forces, spawned defense forces, basically playing by very different rules. And so, now Chris did ask on the Discord server something to the effect of like, what is the difference between spawning waves in and just having the AI build them, like train them through AI scripts? And the difference is, for one, it's harder for you to spawn it in and make it sensible, make it look immersive, than it is to just write custom AI. Writing AI is not difficult. For another, like the more important thing, like what is the difference? Well, when you spawn stuff in, you ignore supply, you ignore resources, you ignore like build times for the units, and you ignore factory counts. Like how many units are you spawning? Are you spawning 3 wraiths on 1 starport? So you can control for some of these variables, but at the same time, the more you have to control, the more variables you control for, the harder it is to actually make a system make sense and be consistent. And so as a result of that, you're again better off just using AI, using AI scripts to tell that part of the story, to set that gameplay up. And so that would be like the main issue with that. Now, part of it is done through, like, obviously you're saying, oh, you're ignoring resources, haha, well, the AI is fed resources anyways. But you can still make the AI resource dependent, just make it so that they get more minerals and gas per return using like the MTL plugin that Nave put together, for example, or GPTP or whatever. Even EXE edits could do this technically, but that would also affect for the players, so you wouldn't want to do that. So yeah, like it's still possible. It's just a matter of making it so that the AI, like you have to do a lot of balancing, you have to do a lot of testing. So it is work, but it's still actually less work than if you were to try to like hack it up together in the context of making it some sort of spawn to trigger fest. And so I would definitely suggest using AI like that. The fact that there was no AI really hurt the project, because any challenge posed by the missions had nothing to do with conventional Brood War skill expression. I talked at length about this in the post-play for the epilogue. Basically, if you're going to be doing something different than Brood War convention, you need to tutorialize that. But you also need to essentially make sure that what you're adding or changing or removing, like whatever your end product is at the end of all of those gameplay changes, still offers a decent amount of skill expression, so players can still express how good they are at your version of StarCraft. And so that obviously wasn't controlled for at all here. Mission 4, that was the first Protoss mission, that's right. This had restricted macro. Mission 5 had no macro. Mission 6 had a microsection into macro, but the objectives had nothing to do with base building, and essentially could have just been a micro mission if you, like, say that base was given to an AI instead of you, or it wasn't ever given to you at all, and just like, you know, the pre-placed photon cannons were under your control or something, and the shield battery maybe, you wouldn't have had to build anything new. I wager you it's probably pretty easy to just, you know, set up your shit and not actually build anything, and just use your, you know, spawned in units and work together with the units that spawn in from Zeratul area. So it was a really weird schizophrenic mission that, again, didn't really work with itself very well. There was very little gameplay communication, which means it's poor gameplay communication, because, again, we're not just sitting down, setting up with a melee environment or even like a puzzle-based environment where you're solving some sort of gameplay puzzle using mostly melee tools. It's not conventional Brood War stuff. The gameplay communication then has to essentially tutorialize that stuff, but there was very little of it. And so I have no idea what the hell I'm doing most of the time. Like I don't know what the timer was for, I think, the third mission. It has nothing to do with anything that, as far as I could see. A lot of just weird things like resource injections in map 1 out of nowhere. Like, why do we get bonus resources? What is the point? Well, how would we possibly know that? What if we get fucked early on by the wraiths and then we have to restart, even though, oh wait, we actually get money? I didn't know that. And then, that suddenly that changes. So none of it is consistent with itself. None of it is consistent with conventional Brood War. And so we get into this really ugly scenario where the lack of gameplay communication, the lack of tutorializing for the new mechanics makes it really difficult for you to then say, hey, there's by the way, there's like this new stuff, but you already died because you thought that this was conventional Brood War. And that was like a lesson that I still hadn't learned in the second mission. I had to restart that mission several times. That was a disaster. So yeah, there's like a lot of problems with just the fact that there's like no communication for what your objectives are for the most part. And when there is, like, sometimes the objectives like run off the screen or something. I think that was map 6 that happened a few times. So I don't know. I feel like the fact that the changes to things like unit costs and unit stats in general, like in the 6th map, none of it was tutorialized very well. And the fact that it was inconsistent with earlier missions and earlier productions, like obviously conventional Brood War plus earlier missions in Aftermath, later missions in Aftermath, had different changes to that. Like photon cannons have different unit costs, and Ultralisks and Spore Colonies and Hatcheries and Dragoons have different stats. Like, what the fuck is happening here? I don't understand why all that stuff was like that in the 6th map. The fact that nothing here was consistent makes it so that it's really hard for players to express their skill in a consistent manner, because you're constantly throwing random, like, half-cocked ideas at them and saying, hey, quick, adapt to this. Except they have no idea. You're not even really telling them to adapt to this, because they don't even know that it happens until it's like it fucks them or something. Like, a lot of the stuff I probably didn't even notice at first. So I would say that there's also very little early game in a lot of the missions. I guess map 3 sort of had one, but you have to do it in such a one-dimensional way where you always have to execute it the same way, basically, by always targeting that top left area, or you're basically forfeiting a whole lot of interaction. And so the solutions to what little puzzles there actually were basic, cheesy, or, like I said, one-dimensional. And as a result of all of these negative adjectives, I would say that the fact that there was little early game, and the fact that we always started out with a lot less, and the AI started out with a lot more, and we still won. I mean, it's just pretty bad. Like, it's pretty fucking bad. I think it could have been done a lot better. Then we get into the pacing issues for gameplay as well, because, like I said, there's like pacing issues for the story. Well, there's pacing issues for the gameplay, constant interruptions. This is back in Echo Syndrome and Vile Aggression Syndrome and Flame Knife Syndrome, where we have this issue where we have to wait for the story to catch up to us so that we can play the game again. So especially in missions 2 and 5, this was very noticeable. So I think I've really covered a lot in the 23 minutes that we've been together. So I'm gonna close this out with the paths to improvement and then give my final thoughts. So the obvious first point is to use custom AI. Design AI for your missions. Make it so that you're using these modern tools on version 1.16.1. You can have an AI that starts out with just as little as the player does, expands to where you want it to, builds structures, places guards exactly where you want, etc. There's all of these different tools that you have at your disposal. I will try to get some guides up, but in the meantime, you can just take a look at these descriptions, like the documentation for the AI commands that I've written, that Necron's written, for the stuff that iQuare and Knave have done, and it will tell you exactly what you need to know. You can get started, you can ask questions. Anybody can do this. It's not difficult. You don't need to learn coding. If you learn how assembly works or something, that might help you understand and comprehend how this stuff works, but for the most part, you really don't need any prior knowledge. I didn't have any prior knowledge with coding, really. I just jumped in and took a look at Blizzard's default scripts, and then Necron helped me out the rest of the way, and now I'm helping you guys out the rest of the way. So just jump in and see what you can do. It really isn't that difficult. And another point to consider, like I said, the story told by the gameplay experience needs to be the same story that's told by the dialogue and the the motion and the voice acting and whatever else. So you're really just using different techniques, different presentation techniques to communicate a different kind of the story, or a different element of the story, but it's still the same story at the end of the day. And so you're essentially taking, like, say the story is a puzzle. Well, gameplay is a big part of that puzzle, but then there's also voice acting and character development and set piece design, environments, whatever, and all of this other stuff. But gameplay is a big part of that. How the AI interacts with you and the strategies they use and the personalities they have, the identity of your faction, any changes that you're making to the units and stuff. Like how does that, what kind of story does that tell? How powerful are your units compared to conventional Brood War units? That's a pretty big deal. I talked at length about the the individual critiques I would have for a story, but as an example, like in the middle of the playthrough, that is. But in the first mission, I have a specific example. So the wraiths that Kerrigan says, she says something like that. Those are evidence of the enemy's desperation. Like they would only send the wraiths at us if they were really desperate. But they start the map attacking you with wraiths. So with that dialogue line, we assume that they're desperate right out the gate. Without that dialogue line, we have no idea that they are desperate. We just figure they're attacking us with wraiths. So a way that you would tell this through gameplay, you would intimate this through gameplay, is they would hold their wraiths to only use them for defense. And then they would only attack when you've struck a daring blow at them and crippled some of their economy, or like attacked them in some way that is really devastating. And then they actually are desperate and attack you with their wraiths. They start to use them with attacks or something. Obviously with wraiths, it's pretty, like, they're not very powerful units, but if they were a bit more powerful, or they were more powerful given the context of like what you had at your disposal, like maybe you can really only use like Hydras and Mutas or something, maybe they start using wraiths more often, and it counters your muta play to some degree, or it harasses your drones or something like that. Like it actually has an impact on the gameplay, but they held off on using them because they're so valuable to them, and then they rebuild them slower, and they have less of them overall, and they're really useful for defense or something. I don't know. You could figure out some way to make it so that the wraiths are actually linked to the Emojin's overall threat level, and then them using them for attacks when they didn't before is evidence of desperation, of a reaction to the player's action. And that would be a story being told by the gameplay without any dialogue. And of course you can augment that with dialogue, but it will make a lot more sense than them just attacking you right out the gate and Kerrigan saying, wow, they must be desperate. Right out the gate? Are they really desperate? I don't know. They've got about 10 billion tanks, and the mission took me an hour to complete. So I don't know how desperate they actually were, man. So that would be a pretty big issue. Now, I'll close this paths to improvement section out. Obviously, that whole bit was, again, telling a coherent story with all elements, because the gameplay tells a very different story when they just start the map attacking you with wraiths than Kerrigan does with the dialogue. So it goes back to that idea of the gameplay not really, or the story overall not being told cohesively. There being multiple kinds of stories being told at the same time. I don't know. It's pretty psychotic. But I'll close this section out by talking about consistency. Again, it feeds back into every single element that we've talked about so far in the review, I'm pretty sure. Consistency is a pretty big deal. No flaw in this campaign was consistent, besides the lack of consistency. And no good thing about this campaign was consistent. Across all maps, across individual elements of individual maps, whatever you want to talk about. And so, I mentioned in the epilogue video that there's a lot of opportunity to change things about conventional StarCraft design. If you prefer something different than conventional StarCraft design, puzzles, whatever, have your own faction and make it so that it has completely different unit behaviors than conventional StarCraft factions or races or whatever, then that's fine. But you need to tutorialize your changes and make it so that this change to the convention is understood. And so that at that point, everybody's on an even playing field, right? People who are worse players will do worse when their skills are actually tested, but at the very least, they'll know that their skills are going to be tested, and they'll have time to work that into their skills. And obviously, better players will perform better. But you shouldn't just rely on map knowledge. You shouldn't have to rely on map knowledge to win. Theoretically, if a player is good enough with their fundamentals, and they're able to learn from your tutorializations, they should be able to beat your map in the first try without having to restart, without having to reload, because of the fact that they are able to express their skill. If you just have it so that this stuff is thrown at the player with no warning, then not only is there no consistency between the missions, because you're just changing stuff between missions, but your changes are also really, like, it just feels unfair at the end of the day. And so you want to make it so that the changes to the convention are consistent across all missions, so that when I get better at learning how to play your version of StarCraft in map 1, I can express that skill in all of the future maps, from the beginning of the campaign to the end. And it also is something that, again, I have some breathing room, I have some onboarding time. You have tutorialized it to me in some respects, so that after the first mission, or after the first phase of the first mission, I'm expected to use this new mechanic or accept this new design convention in such a way that it will give me a leg up in future engagements. Or if I don't use that, if I don't take that into account, then I will be at a disadvantage. And that'll be me expressing my lack of skill as opposed to expressing my presence of skill. So yeah, that would be like a big deal. And again, it feels unfair. It requires map knowledge in the current state. And you could really mitigate a lot of that. You can completely eradicate that if you just make it so that your changes to the convention are consistent across all maps, and your changes to the convention are tutorialized in some way. So those are like the bottom lines there. And while there are other things that I think could be improved about the design philosophy of Christopher Ang as I have reverse engineered it, I think that focusing on making things consistent from gameplay to storytelling, and using modern tools with AI and just modding in general, will allow you to more efficiently express your concepts, again, be they gameplay or story. And those are the best starting points. I think other elements, while they do exist, they might be rough around the edges. It's hard for me to even identify them, given the fact that everything else about these really core concepts is very faulty, and they can be worked on over time a lot easier than these core concepts. Like if you don't have consistency, and just like obviously AI is a big part of that, but if you don't have consistency in everything that you're doing, then it's a lot harder for me to pick out like the few things that aren't consistent with everything else, because right now nothing is consistent. So I would really focus on trying to master that big beast that, yes, Big Beast, that's the title of the review. Master the big beast, and then worry about like the little hatchlings that it's left along the way. And you can clean up that mess later on. So my final thoughts. Aftermath has a lot of flaws. I don't think that it's an easy project to recommend to anyone. I think that the playthrough has some pretty good analysis, and I'm pretty confident in the review that I've produced. So I guess my commentary is probably useful, but I don't know that anything I say is impossible to understand or find. If like I don't think that anything I discuss in this playthrough and in this review is something that can't be gleaned by experimenting on your own time. And with enough experimentation, you'd probably be able to, sort of arrive at similar conclusions, if not identical ones, to a lot of the things that I said about this particular production. So I guess I'll just recommend the playthrough itself to people who feel like they're spinning their wheels in a rut and they're not able to really evolve their design philosophy, because that is essentially what Christopher Ang said to me about this particular production. So hopefully it's been useful in that respect, but I don't think it's really not something that's super necessary for other people. And if you have something that you want me to elaborate on when it comes to making a point in the review, and you think it would be useful for fast-tracking you and other developers without being connected to this specific project, then just let me know and request it or whatever, and I will see if I can do that, because it'll probably be a little bit easier to abstract it out of this particular thing, extract it from this this campaign, and just talk about it in a vacuum or something like that. So, but yeah, in the context of Aftermath, I feel like this is definitely something that I would not recommend. Chris works hard on revamping. I don't know that the core concept is strong enough to really warrant that, at least if your intent is to make a well-rounded, solid project. But if your intent is just to experiment, and you want to experiment by improving, making improved versions of these maps or whatever, go on ahead. And of course, Chris or anybody else, if you have any other questions or thoughts, feel free to let me know about them, and I will respond to them in the comments or on Discord or wherever else you choose to kiss me. Mwah.